Welcome to this explainer. You know that feeling when your family drives you absolutely up the wall, yet at the same time, you would do literally anything for them? Well, today, we are going to decode the hidden math of family dynamics. We're going to dive into the fascinating evolutionary science that explains exactly why we treat our own flesh and blood so incredibly differently than we treat strangers. Let's kick things off with a pretty intense thought experiment. Imagine you're standing outside a burning building. You only have time to run in and save one person. Inside is a complete passing stranger and your sibling. Who are you going to save? If you're being totally honest with yourself, it's probably not the stranger, right? But why is that instinct so deeply, inextricably ingrained in our psychology? Well, just imagine a world where you loved everyone equally. A world where you'd be just as likely to pay for a random neighbor's college education as your own kids, or hand your dinner to a passing stranger instead of your brother. I mean, sure, it sounds peaceful, maybe, but to our brains it feels completely absurd. Evolutionary psychology and inclusive fitness theory explain exactly why this equal love utopia just doesn't exist, and why we're basically biologically programmed to play favorites. So here's our roadmap for decoding these biological calculations. We'll cover the calculus of kinship, look at how we recognize relatives, explore the high stakes of life and inheritance, unpack the grandparent effect, and finally, look at the roots of family conflict. Okay, part one, the calculus of kinship. Let's move from the paradox of love to the actual hard evolutionary math that drives it. To really get this, we have to talk about inclusive fitness. Evolutionary biology reminds us that, at the end of the day, we are essentially just vehicles for our genes. Your inclusive fitness isn't just about your own personal survival and reproduction. It's calculated from your own reproductive success, plus your effects on the reproductive success of your relatives. Because they share your genes, your relatives are actually vehicles of your fitness too. And this brings us to the famous Hamilton's rule. The formula is simply C is less than R times B. Basically, natural selection favors a seemingly selfless act if the cost to you, the actor, is less than the genetic relatedness multiplied by the benefit to the recipient. Think about the genetic math here. You share about 50% of your genes with your parents, children, and full siblings. That drops to 25% for grandparents, aunts, uncles, and half-siblings, and goes down again to 12.5% for first cousins. This subconscious calculus predicts that we are literally wired to help close kin more than distant kin, and distant kin more than complete strangers. Section 2. Recognizing our relatives. Because this brings up a very logical next question. How do our brains actually know who our relatives are so we can help them? We certainly don't walk around with DNA testing kits. Well, evolution has actually equipped us with 4 main biological mechanisms to detect family. First up is early association, basically just growing up together in childhood. Second is odor. Amazingly, mothers can actually identify their newborn's smell from a worn shirt, and breastfed newborns prefer the scent of their own mothers. Third is a universal grammar of kin classification, meaning how every human culture categorizes people by genealogical distance and rank. And fourth is phenotypic resemblance, which is really just a fancy scientific way of saying facial or physical similarity. Think about how much we rely on specific visual cues. Research actually shows that if you mask the lower half of someone's face, our ability to recognize them as kin only drops by about 5%. But if you mask the upper half of their face, our kin recognition performance drops by a massive 65%. It brilliantly illustrates just how deeply embedded this visual kin detection software really is in our psychology. Moving on to Section 3, Life, Death, and Inheritance. Let's see how this builds when the stakes are at their absolute highest, survival and legacy. If we map our tendency to help people of varying ages, it reveals something totally fascinating. For everyday help, like picking up an item from the store, we actually help 75-year-olds quite a bit. But look what happens in life or death conditions. As the person's age increases, our willingness to help just plummets. In life or death situations, we strongly prefer to save younger relatives who have higher future reproductive value. And this isn't just a hypothetical scenario. To put it into perspective, think about the Mayflower pioneers who settled in America in the brutal winter of 1620. Conditions were terrible, and a staggering 51% of the original colonists died. When researchers analyzed who lived and who died, the single strongest predictor of survival was simply the number of genetic relatives a person had in the colony. In evolutionary bottlenecks, having kin nearby is quite literally the difference between life and death. And this genetic math literally dictates how we distribute wealth from beyond the grave. Data from a huge study of 1,000 wills in Vancouver shows a massive disparity. Over 92% of estate wealth went to spouses and kin, while a tiny 7.7% went to non-relatives. Furthermore, people left nearly 39% of their wealth to their children, but less than 8% to their siblings. Even though you are 50% related to both, your children are younger and have more reproductive value, so the evolutionary calculus dictates they get the inheritance. Crazy, right? Section 4. The grandparent effect. This introduces a fascinating twist into our biological math and explains why certain grandparents might just seem a little bit more invested than others. So, the crucial point here is understanding the difference between maternity certainty and paternity uncertainty. Think about it. Mothers are always 100% certain their children carry their genes. But historically, fathers face the evolutionary risk that the child might not actually be genetically theirs. For a grandfather on the father's side, this is a total double whammy. He isn't 100% sure his son is his, and he isn't 100% sure his son's children are his sons. And the result of this is pretty staggering across all categories of closeness, time, knowledge, and resources. The maternal grandmother, who has zero relational uncertainty, invests the absolute most. Conversely, the paternal grandfather faces that double whammy of paternity uncertainty we just talked about, so he mathematically invests the least. And we see this exact same mathematical certainty play out with cousins. When asked who they would save in a burning building, people expressed a much, much higher willingness to help their mother's sister's children, where maternal certainty is high, than their father's brother's children. The evolutionary math is just staggeringly consistent across the board. Finally, Section 5, the roots of family conflict. Let's look at the dark side of families. Because the very same genetic math that causes deep love mathematically guarantees family drama. Evolutionary biologists point out that families are actually shaped by conflict over limited resources. The three major vectors here are sibling rivalry, parent-offspring battles, and maternal-paternal conflicts. So let's break down exactly why this happens. It all comes down to what's called sibling scramble competition. Think back to Hamilton's rule for a second. You are 50% related to your sibling, but you are 100% related to yourself. This means you will always value your own survival and resources twice as much as your siblings. Therefore, you are naturally going to demand more of your parents' resources, whether that's attention, food, or college tuition, than your parents, who are equally related to both of you, actually want to give to just one child. This leads to bitter rivalries, sometimes even escalating into those major inheritance lawsuits we hear about. There's this classic joke from our source text that perfectly sums up this evolutionary tug-of-war. A college student writes home, "Dear Dad, no mon, no fun, your son." To which the father replies, "Dear son, too bad, so sad, your dad." It's a funny little exchange, but it perfectly highlights the biological reality. Selection favors adaptations in children to manipulate parents for a larger share of resources, and counter-adaptations in parents to resist bending solely to one child's desires. So we've decoded the hidden math of family, from life-or-death rescues to inheritance, and from grandparental favoritism to sibling scramble competition. It is all driven by the subconscious calculations of inclusive fitness. I want to leave you with this final thought. Next time you're arguing with your family over the holidays or fighting with a sibling over who gets the absolute last slice of pie, ask yourself, is it personal or is it just evolutionary math? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.